Alrighty then. Hello and welcome to episode 101 of Question and Answer. I am your host, as usual, Panyo Basa. And we don't have an extremely large number of questions to answer this time, so we're probably not going to stretch anywhere near to 3.5 hours like we have done recently, because there was like a merciless onslaught of questions. Apparently, what happened is that Q&A 100, the previous Q&A, which was live streamed, was so emotionally exhausting for everybody that they just don't have as many questions now. Yeah, it was slightly traumatic doing that live stream. It was my first live stream ever, and it took like 2 aborted first attempts because I didn't realize that I was actually live streaming, and there's no indication that I was live streaming other than people in the chat saying, "Hey, you're live streaming." So it took me like 3 tries to finally realize that it was actually working. But that's all in the past now. So I got my beverage, got my emergency backup beverage, and so I'm ready to start commencing answering these here particular questions. And the first one is from Fred. And Fred says, "In my opinion, spirit is the flow. What's your idea? Is Chitta spirit?" And I mean, the answer to that question largely depends on what one's definition of spirit is going to be. I mean, spirit can have lots of different meanings. Apparently, he just means like, if not just human vitality, it would be like human mentality. So, yeah, I mean, I would agree that spirit would, I mean, at like the samsaric level, spirit would be the flow of mental states, which is essentially karma. You know, it's like the momentum of your mental states. Although if you want to get into a higher definition, you could say that spirit is consciousness, so that the same spirit pretty much pervades all sentient beings. Although that is heresy from a Theravada point of view, because according to Abhidhamma philosophy, you've got a different consciousness every moment. So in a way, it would be a flow of consciousness too, but you can't have consciousness without something to be conscious of, which means mental states. So, like from a Theravada Buddhist point of view, I mean, you couldn't just say that Chitta is spirit, because Chitta, it can mean mind, but also in a more technical sense in Theravada, it just means consciousness or vijnana. So it wouldn't just be that. It would have to be like the entire baggage of mental states, like feelings and volitions and perceptions and so forth, that all of that together in a kind of mental stream would be your spirit. But if you wanted to get really metaphysical and absolutist, you could say that the human spirit is just like the formless infinite consciousness that neither exists nor doesn't exist, and etc. That, you know, it's like theists would call it God, Taoists call it Tao, Hindus call it Brahman, etc. That could just be like the fundamental underlying spirit, but Theravada, Orthodox Theravada, doesn't work that way. So according to Orthodox Theravada, the human spirit would probably just be the individual's flow of consciousness and mental states, which is what transmigrates from one life to the next. You know, it's just the momentum of your mental states. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from GameFap. And GameFap says, "Do you and Brian still have arguments about your boy AH?" And I assume by AH he is referring to the Führer. And okay, I'll just continue. I'll just start over again. That's what I'm going to do. I'm having a block here. GameFap says, "Do you and Brian still have arguments about your boy AH? I remember seeing your videos on BitChute a while back." Well, I mean, Brian, just for matters of personal survival and just he's just gone into a different direction now. He really doesn't talk about AH very much anymore. I might even talk about AH a little more than he does now, simply because, I mean, he's just kind of avoiding the issue for easily understandable reasons, because he's gotten into a lot of hot water over that sort of thing. So we don't have any arguments. I mean, we've talked about him in a few videos in the past. I think I was still a monk at that time, and we had a debate that got a little bit heated, where, you know, he's saying that Hitler didn't do anything wrong. You know, he was a good guy. And I was saying, well, I mean, he may not have been any worse than somebody like Stalin, but I mean, he was like largely just demonized, so that, you know, most people nowadays, if they had to pick who's the evilest human being who ever lived, Hitler might get more votes than anybody else, just mainly, largely because of propaganda. But so I'm saying that Hitler, I mean, he wasn't like some sort of inhuman monster, that he was sort of an opportunistic, nationalistic politician who wound up on the losing side, and so he just got dogpiled and demonized. I mean, if he was on the winning side, his picture might be on our money right now. But anyways, let's see. Yeah, we don't still have arguments. We had like one argument, which was just this debate that we had, where, you know, I was saying that, you know, Hitler did make mistakes. He wasn't all good. You know, he did lie sometimes, broke promises, that sort of thing. But on the other hand, I mean, he wasn't, I mean, I consider Stalin probably to have been a worse human being than Hitler was. But Stalin was on our side, so you can't badmouth him too much. And furthermore, he was a leftist. So, yeah, I guess I could have just said nope and just moved on to the next question. So I guess I should, because Brian and I do not have, I mean, we haven't discussed Hitler in a long time. Although I will say that one of my most popular YouTube videos, ironically, is on esoteric Hitlerism, which is a video I did with Otto a couple years ago. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovach and Sipad Zidana. And Siovach and Sipad Zidana says, can you please show us what your question list looks like? I'm curious how or where they are written down when you answer them. Well, my question list is, no, I just hit the microphone. My question list is right there on the screen there. So you just got to kind of turn your head very sharply, and maybe you'll be able to see it. But I do have like a screen share option on this video software that I'm using, but I've never used it before, and I'm not going to experiment for fear of just completely ruining everything. So, I mean, it's just a document, and I just cut and paste questions onto this document. It's like a scroll going down. It's in Georgia font, and the people's names who asked the questions are in bold type. And then their questions are listed below that, and it's generally in alphabetical order. So I guess you can just imagine that in your mind. Just a bare bones document file that just has, you know, the name of the person in bold type and then their questions underneath, and it's just a scroll that goes down. So I'm just going to scroll up to Siovach and Sipad Zidana's next question, or scroll down. It's called scrolling down, I think, but actually all the text is moving up. So it's kind of paradoxical, if you will. Anyways, his next question is, why did you end up moving from Burma to California? Well, I mainly just burned out on Burma. Although last time I was in Burma, I was staying in a monastery, Migadawun Monastery, in the foothills of the Shan Plateau. And the abbot there was getting older. He was looking for someone to replace him as abbot. And I offered my services. I said, I'll be permanent abbot here if you like. But he had already promised some Burmese scholar monk that he could be abbot. And so I came like that close to just committing myself to spending the rest of my life as a monk in Burma. Although how well that would have worked when the military coup occurred and all that, I don't know. most of the people I know of who were living in Burma who weren't Burmese citizens just left after that. So why did I end up moving from Burma to California? Mainly, I was just burned out on living in Burma. Just sweating all the time, not being able to speak English, just getting weird tropical diseases and so forth. I felt that like I would be of more use in the West, where I can speak the same language as people, and I can sort of see more eye to eye with people as a general rule, at least slightly more eye to eye. And so I just burned out on Burma and decided to come back to America. And the obvious choice at the time was a Burmese monastery that is in the Tongpulu tradition, which was the tradition in which I was ordained. There was a monastery in Fremont, California, and a monastery in French Camp, California, just a few miles south of Stockton. And a monk in the Tongpulu tradition who was one of my teachers in the early days and who participated in my ordination ceremony and all that. He was the abbot at one of those monasteries. So I moved there, and it really didn't work because as a general rule, Burmese monks in the West, they don't follow Vinaya very well, if at all. I mean, they have to follow it at least enough so that they look like monks and so forth. But it was the sort of monastery that I generally avoided like the plague when I could. And then I wound up just kind of being just sort of transplanted there, and it just did not work. But I mean, the main reason why I moved from Burma to California was I was just burned out on Burma. I guess that's the short answer. So I'm just going to move on to Seal of Action Sipad Zirna's next question, which is, last week you said things aren't ultimately real despite them having causal consequences on other things because these causal relations are not ultimately real. Can you explain what you mean? I mean, I've explained this many times, and I think there's a lot of people, probably most people, that aren't going to be able to really grasp what I'm saying, partly because it's such a weird idea that, I mean, it's just kind of, it leaves ordinary, normie, samsaric, empirical reality behind. So it may be that if you've heard me explain this several times and you still don't get it, you're probably just not going to get it. Not that I'm trying to be offensive in any way, but there is a good chance of that. Sort of like discussing mysticism with an intellectual that just doesn't get mysticism, like Stephen Hawking or Bertrand Russell. They just did not get mysticism. They didn't appreciate it at all. They just kind of thought it was not a very good idea, etc. So anyways, let's see. I'll just ask the question again. Last week, you said things aren't ultimately real despite them having causal consequences on other things because those causal relations are not ultimately real. Can you explain what you mean? Well, it's like, I mean, the easiest way that I can explain this is just falling back on the standard simile of the block of marble. All right, you got the block of marble that contains within it every single possible statue. And reality, according to the hypothesis, works that way. You've got this formless, infinite energy or consciousness or whatever you want to call it, and it contains within it all possibilities in a kind of virtual form, the same way that the statues are contained within the block of marble in virtual form. Every single molecule of every statue is already there in the exact correct position. It's already there. All you got to do is just kind of imaginatively separate out the excess rock, and you've got the statue already there. Every single Venus, Laocoon and his sons getting eaten by snakes, the discus thrower, the dying Gaul, Michelangelo's David, Michelangelo's Moses with horns. It's all in there. Every single molecule is already there. But what causes it to seem real is dependent co-arising. things arise together in dependence upon each other, and they're not ultimately real, they're virtually real. But this web of conditions is sort of mutually conditioning everything. It's sort of like a complex ecosystem. And it just causes this version of reality to seem to exist. So, did I answer the question? I assume I did. I kind of did anyway. Although, how many people will understand the explanation is another question. And I'm not going to answer that one because I don't know the answer. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Raphael. And Raphael's question is, can you react to this? And in parentheses, he's got your favorite topic. And he included this with a little video about Protestant Buddhism. Apparently, a Mahayana Buddhist, or sort of like a Buddhist eclectic who just like accepts all of it, all the different schools, he considers them to be equally valid, equally genuine, equally authentic. And so he tries to debunk the idea that the Pali Canon is genuine Buddhism and that Mahayana Buddhism just got made up and is fake Buddhism. And he uses some good arguments, but also he uses some bad arguments to make his point. For example, let's see, I've got some notes here. He claims that the Pali Canon, being the oldest set of scriptures, is just plain wrong, based on the fact that the Pali Canon wasn't written down until around the same time that Mahayana texts were written down. That's one of his arguments. That, the recorded existence of Theravada and Mahayana is about equally old. Mainly just because texts just started getting written down around the same time throughout India. So even older texts would be finally written down around the same time as the newer texts are written down. And then also he said, also one bit of evidence he uses to debunk the idea that Pali texts are genuine or original and Mahayana texts aren't, is that Theravada continued to evolve long after the canon was finalized. He even says that Theravada didn't even reach its present state until about 200 years ago, which is, it's always going to be evolving. Everything's going to be evolving. But still, it's like a simplistic argument, and he apparently doesn't really understand things. Maybe he just doesn't want to look at the evidence or whatever. But the fact is that the Pali Canon very probably contains more authentic teachings of the Buddha than the Mahayana Tripitaka, which is just this huge library of books. So, let's see. Also, he said this strange thing that I'm not sure if there's any factuality behind it. He said that Theravada and Mahayana existed peacefully side by side in Sri Lanka up until the Mahavihara, which was it was a hotbed of radical fundamentalist Buddhism, was supported by some king, and then the Mahayana Buddhists were extirpated through, extreme violence. And maybe, it wouldn't put it past me if that sort of thing happened. Some Sri Lankan king in ancient times converts to Theravada Buddhism and just starts violently persecuting non-Theravadins or something. But he really doesn't have a very nuanced approach to this. That probably, evidently, based on the evidence, that you had early teachings and the older schools all pretty much accept these early teachings, and then they added some of their own teachings to that. And then just through evolution, things start evolving. But still, after about 500 years of this, then Mahayana came along, and it probably evolved gradually, didn't really become like a real movement up until people are saying that it arose around 500 years after the time of the Buddha, 400 or 500 years. and then all kinds of new ideas got added that the older texts are just oblivious to. They don't even respond, So it's like the Mahayana idea is that the Buddha had all these teachings, including Mahayana teachings, and for some reason, the oldest text, or like the Theravadan text, and what the Mahayana Buddhists call the Agamas, which is very similar to the Theravada Pali Canon, which is contained in the Mahayana Tripitaka, but is largely ignored. See, where was I? Too many digressions in that sentence. Let's see. What was I saying? Oh, yeah. So you got these older texts that just are completely clueless. They've never heard of Amitabha Buddha. They've never heard of all these bodhisattvas. They've never heard of just huge retinues of Pacceka Buddhas coming to listen to the Buddhist talks and this sort of thing. It's like this development of doctrine. And you can even see that within the Pali text, how there's a development of doctrine. So you start off with really archaic texts like the Atthaka Wagga, the Sutta Nipata, and then it just kind of gradually evolves. And you can see, I think my personal training in biology helps me to see some of this stuff, that it's an evolutionary process, and you're not going to have archaic and relatively derived or advanced doctrines arising at the same time, and just being completely divorced from each other, separate from each other. It's like the Buddha is teaching this really advanced but still very simplistic, a kind of pure mysticism, and then also maybe to other disciples while the first disciples are required to go away and not listen. He's talking about all this pure land stuff, for example. It's just not very likely at all that the standard consensus is more likely to be correct, that you had the Buddha teaching a very simple, archaic, kind of pure Dhamma, and then almost as soon as he dies, probably even before he dies to some degree, it starts getting elaborated upon and the ideas start evolving. Some ideas kind of fall by the wayside. Other ideas are emphasized, and then their meanings kind of branch out. Different schools will interpret the meanings of certain things differently, and so forth. And this just keeps happening. And it's a few centuries later that things are so divergent from the original teachings that you start getting teachings that really are just contradictory to what the Buddha taught. And some Mahayana texts teach stuff that the historical Buddha not only would not have endorsed, I think he probably would have outspokenly denounced it. So yeah, that's my reaction to this little video that Raphael posted on the Discord server. Yeah, I think you could get a much more nuanced and intelligent response to that same issue from even a lot of Mahayana scholars. So I'll just move on to Raphael's next question, which is similar. It's, can you respond to this video? And then as a kind of commentary, he says, Richard is a vegan YouTuber who says a mushroom trip cured his lifelong depression. He says the trip helped him internalize nihilism. Unfortunately, he thinks Buddhism has something to do with nihilism. Perhaps you can clear up this widespread misunderstanding. And I think the only real thing that he is, at least in the short video that Raphael had me watch, his take on nihilism, at least in that video, is that everything is ultimately meaningless. And I mean, you could say the same thing with regard to early Buddhism also, that samsara is perception. Samsara is meaning. That ultimately nibbana is meaningless, because meaning is a kind of symbolic interpretation where, you just separate out something and then you slap a label onto it and you slap a description onto it, and then that's the meaning. And that can't happen without a kind of samsaric mentality going on, which does not really represent ultimate reality. So what he's calling nihilism, like 100 years ago, would have been called existentialism, that, you know, the world is ultimately meaningless. But I think the main difference is that even an existentialist would probably think that the world really exists. You know, the trees and the grass and the clouds and the rivers and houses and all that. There is some reality there. Whereas in very early Buddhism, I mean, you're not supposed to even go that far. So it's not so much nihilism or skepticism, though. It's kind of very advanced mysticism, where you are going beyond the illusion, going beyond, you know, the veil, the painted veil or whatever, and getting into the undifferentiated absolute, which is beyond that or underlies it. So, I mean, you could say that there is a similarity between like existentialism or nihilism on the one hand, and the Buddhist idea that this is all an illusion, so that ultimately what you think has meaning is an illusion. So the meaning itself is illusory. But really, it's like materialistic normie types who cannot see a distinction between those two. You know, they really just do not grasp any ultimate reality beyond the phenomenal universe. And so if you reject the validity of the phenomenal universe, all that's left for a materialistic normie is just nothingness, just void. And Buddhists can talk about void and nothingness too, but they're not really referring to a big zero. You know, they're just referring to something that's off the scale. The mind can't grasp it. And so there's no point in even trying. So let's see. I guess I responded to the video. I mean, I don't fully recall everything that he was saying, though. But I do think that what he's calling nihilism is just the idea that this world is ultimately meaningless. And I think the Buddha may have agreed with that. So, yeah. So I guess I better just move on to the next question. This is from Skoladin or Skuladin. And this question I do not fully understand. If a body is revived from a cryo freezer, then would it be a candidate for reincarnation? So, and then he's got like a little commentary here, like all those eccentric millionaires such as Walt Disney. So is Walt Disney a corpuscle? Is he frozen somewhere right now in liquid nitrogen or something? If so, somebody should revive him and point out the abomination that Disney has become. But I think Skoladin's question here is, if you are frozen cryogenically and then you are revived, would that be a case of reincarnation? And if it's the same karmic stream, then I guess it really wouldn't be. You'd just be like in a state of suspended animation. It is kind of an interesting question. What happens to your spirit when your body is essentially dead? You know, it's like when you're frozen solid, I mean, there's no metabolic processes going on, ideally. So you'd be dead. And then when you get thawed out and revived, you're alive again. What happens in between? You know, it's sort of like little rotifers or tardigrades, these little invertebrate animals that can completely dehydrate. Even like some frogs can do this, or lungfish. You know, they just dry out and become brittle and hard, and there's no respiration going on, so they're dead. You know, they're not alive. I mean, they're potentially alive, but there's no respiration going on. You know, the life processes, you know, the biochemical reactions are pretty much stopped. And so what happens to the spirit of that rotifer or tardigrade or frog or lungfish? It's kind of a good question, and I don't think that the early Buddhists really considered that sort of thing. Or for that matter, just somebody who's in a coma. You know, it's like, where is their spirit? What's their spirit doing? Is it in like some other realm? Or is it just like dormant? So, I mean, with that, it's kind of a good question. I do think it's like your spirit would have to be somewhere doing something. I don't think that your spirit just completely just shuts down if you're cryogenically frozen or in a coma, or you're estivating, you're dehydrated, buried in the mud, waiting for the rain to fall again. So it would be like beyond the scope of this world, what's actually going on. It'd be something going on at some level. It's just not going on here. That would be my best guess. And so I'm going to move on to the next question, also from Skoladin. Would you kindly explain parallel worlds? I've listened to a bunch of nerds argue about this, and they fully believe they understand physics because they saw a Marvel movie or something. I guess. I don't know. Well, you can learn stuff from Marvel movies, but I don't think the parallel worlds thing is really fully fleshed out in the Marvel superhero movies, mainly because they got to deal with the action sequences and special effects and all that. So, I mean, my explanation of parallel worlds goes right back to the block of marble again. Every single possible statue is contained in that block of marble, which would contain an infinite number of different world scenarios. It's all there. I mean, if you want to get into like some kind of Einsteinian explanation of it, then the world is more than 4 dimensionals. Let's say you got 3 dimensions of space, according to Einstein, 1 dimension of time, which forms the 4-dimensional space-time continuum. But let's say there's more than 1 dimension of time. Let's say you can move sideways through time. Then, I mean, you move a little bit sideways through time and you might be in a different version of reality. It's like a different probability. It's like whenever anybody has to make a decision, any kind of seemingly free choice, or at the very least, any decision where quantum randomness at the neurological level is going to allow more than one possibility, then the universe is just splitting every time that happens. And so you've got just an infinite number of universes just by moving sideways through time, so to speak. But my theory of the block of marble accounts for that pretty well. And it's just the interlocking web of causes and conditions that cause one world to seem different from another world, even though they're all superimposed upon each other. You're just tuned into this frequency. This is the radio station you're tuned into, so this is the world you see. But if you're tuned into a different frequency, you'd see a different world. If it was a very different frequency, it'd be a very different world. Slightly different frequency, it might just be a slightly different world. But yeah, I definitely do agree with the parallel worlds. I mean, even in quantum physics, now I keep bringing up the same things. It's like when a subatomic particle travels from point A to point B, it doesn't just take one route. It takes every possible route. It takes an infinite number of routes. And it's just like we focus in on one of those routes, but all of those routes are equally real. And so, I mean, that's like parallel worlds at a sub-microscopic level. So I guess I answered that question. I'm just going to move on to Skoladin's next question, which is, would you rate Brian Aldiss's prose? And then he's got like the little commentary. I saw one of the last works he published was a book of poetry with a psychedelic evil alien on the cover titled Prehistory of the Mind. So, Brian Aldiss's prose, I mean, he's no Tolstoy, he's no Dostoevsky. He's like a good science fiction writer who is very imaginative. Most science fiction writers, their imagination peters out at about 100 or 200 years in the future. Brian Aldiss would write stories literally billions of years in the future. And I mean, he had a really good imagination and really good ideas. He was an intelligent man. But I mean, his prose was not classic prose. It's one thing that I was really into science fiction up until I got into college and started taking English lit classes and starting having to read like Dostoevsky and Melville and that kind of stuff, which then kind of spoiled science fiction because you go back to reading pulpy science fiction, most of it, and it's just sort of like childish, attempts at character development and just like the prose of the sentences and that sort of thing. It's just kind of sad when you go back to reading the stuff that you used to like. You become like a snob, essentially. So Brian Aldiss's prose, his writing style, I think it would be above average for science fiction writers or just like mass market fiction writers, although it doesn't rise to the level of Dostoevsky. But then again, most writers don't rise to the level of Dostoevsky. So, yeah, he was, as like a science fiction author goes, in my opinion, he's one of the best. But if you're going to start comparing him with like real, like highbrow literature, it's not going to compare very well. And with regard to his poetry, the only poetry I read from Brian Aldiss was, there's a novel that he wrote called Barefoot in the Head, which is about, it's like post World War III, but World War III is fought with like hallucinogenic aerosol bombs. Everyone's just tripping balls on acid. You've got entire armies that are just like dropping their guns and rolling around on the floor laughing. And so civilization is collapsing. And in between chapters of this story, he's got like it's like song lyrics that's essentially poetry. It's like lyrical poetry. And I wasn't extremely impressed. I would still prefer Yeats or Coleridge to Brian Aldiss's poetry. Just because you're good at one thing doesn't mean you're necessarily good at other things. Michelangelo, he wanted to make it big as a poet. He mainly got famous as a painter and sculptor. Herman Melville wrote a lot of poetry, but he's mainly famous because of Moby Dick and maybe Billy Budd. So, yeah, he did write poetry, though. I'll grant him that. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Outer Haven. And Outer Haven says, I saw something the other day that vexed me. A voice actor I follow got some harassment from some fans because she hired an artist that said politically incorrect things in the past. For me, it goes against my essence when I see people demand that because they do not approve of someone, therefore others should not be allowed to like them either. I'm sure you can relate to this, as probably a lot of people have gotten pissed at you for refusing to disassociate yourself from Brian Rue. I feel this shows why forgiveness can be an important virtue, something lacking in American culture. What do you recommend when you see or are in such situations? Well, first of all, just don't apologize and stand by your conscience. I do this to some degree. Not so much with Brian Rue. I think I've actually received more praise than blame for remaining friends with Brian Rue. And, no amount of blame would cause me to stop being friends with Brian Rue, because I know Brian Rue. I know deep down he's a good guy. He's a better Buddhist than most of the Buddhists who are like dissing him online, or let alone the people spitting on him in the street. I'm better at sort of dissociating a person from like their personal life from what they produce. Like Woody Allen, for example. I still think Woody Allen's funny. Whether he had sexual relations with an adopted Korean stepdaughter or something, it has no effect at all on how funny some of his old movies were. Like Love and Death, it's one of my favorite movies because I've read a lot of Russian 19th century Russian novels, and so I get a lot of the jokes that he makes about that. Or like Bill Cosby. When I was a kid, I had this Bill Cosby record. And he's just talking about, his friends, Crying Charlie and a Weird Harold and this kind of stuff. And it was funny. It was appropriate for kids. There's nothing inappropriate in there. But now, apparently, because for decades he was drugging women and having sexual relations with them when they were unconscious, all of a sudden, every joke he ever told is no longer funny. I mean, you're just not allowed to laugh at anything Bill Cosby ever said. So, I mean, that kind of thing, I just can't really relate to it very well. But, I mean, you follow your own conscience. I mean, when you start following the conscience of a hysterical mob, I mean, your ass may be saved, but still, I mean, you're no better than they are at that point. And you're just kind of a coward, essentially. So you got to stand by your principles. I mean, you can do it diplomatically so that you're not just being rude at the people that are blaming you, but you're just saying, I know the situation. I know I'm doing what I consider to be the right thing. And yeah, I mean, forgiving people. I mean, Jesus of Nazareth, not that I'm trying to compare myself with Jesus of Nazareth necessarily, but he caught a lot of hell for that sort of thing too. He'd be hanging out with tax collectors and women of ill repute. And then he would say, it's like the doctor comes to heal the sick, not the healthy. That kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, just don't apologize. Apologizing to like hysterical leftists just puts blood in the water, and then it's like a sign of weakness, and then they really start dogpiling. It's not going to work. So just stand your ground. Do it politely, honestly, but still, you got to follow your own conscience and not the conscience of blockheads. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Mr. Pranav. And Mr. Pranav says, what is the sound of one hand clapping? So I'll just move on to the next question. Mr. Pranav says, what are your thoughts on engaged Buddhism that were started by Thích Nhất Hạnh? And I really don't know that much about Thích Nhất Hạnh. First of all, he was like a Mahayana Buddhist. I have read a few things that he was saying. In fact, one of the things that Thích Nhất Hạnh said that just has abided in my memory is he's saying, how can anybody believe the first noble truth of Buddhism when they look into the shining eyes of a child? It's like, how can everything be dukkha when this child's eyes are shining so delightfully? And that kind of thing. I mean, it's Mahayana, it's more feelings oriented. I'm sure that it was sort of politically correct. It's like the lefties probably liked Thích Nhất Hạnh a lot. And with regard to the engaged Buddhism aspect of it, I'm not exactly sure how engaged his Buddhism was because, frankly, I just don't know that much about it. I was never really interested in it. I've mainly been interested in Theravada, like the pre-Mahayana schools, and also some of the aspects of Mahayana, like Prajna Paramita or Madhyamaka, that were still like in the vein of what the early Buddhism was teaching. In a way, it was kind of a reform movement, trying to even get back closer to what the Buddha originally taught, that kind of thing. But like the other stuff of Mahayana, like Pure Land Buddhism or Thích Nhất Hạnh denying the first noble truth and that sort of thing, or just denying its universality. I just was never really drawn to that, never really interested in that. So I really can't say that much about his thoughts or the engaged Buddhism that was started by Thích Nhất Hạnh. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Elias saying, can you buy a microphone to improve the sound? Well, that's what this is. It's a microphone. And I already bought it. And I bought it a long time ago. And it is true that there have been some issues with the sound on my videos, especially like in the live stream one I did last week. I noticed the sound would get wonky when I'd be like leaning forwards trying to read the tiny text of the chats. But this time I'm trying to fix it a little bit because I do have some like sound editing software that I stopped using because it wasn't recognizing my new camera because it was video and audio. So I'm just using it for audio just to see if there's any improvement. But for the most part, when I listen to my own videos, it doesn't sound that bad other than the occasional slight glitch somewhere. So I can buy a microphone, but probably I'm not going to unless there's just a hue and cry of protest against my sound quality, in which case I might fork out another $100 for a different microphone, which may not work any better than this one. It may just be that I'm using it wrong. I've got the settings set on it wrong or some such. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, in your last Q&A, number 100, you mentioned that generally your main meditation practices currently are walking meditation and general mindfulness throughout your day, as opposed to when you were a monk and long sitting meditations were your mainstay. I also try to incorporate mindfulness throughout my day. However, increasingly, I am finding my smartphone a constant distraction and barrier from my intention to be mindful and live fully in the present moment. Despite my goal to use my smartphone as sparingly as possible, my urge to resist glancing at and or using my phone throughout the day is becoming more and more difficult. Is your smartphone an impediment to your being focused mindfully throughout the day, as mine is? Do you have any practical tips on how I could be less distracted by my compulsion to use my smartphone throughout the day? Are mindfulness and frequent smartphone use incompatible, or is it possible to blend these seemingly polar opposites in today's hyper-connected age? Well, with regard to myself, I mean, it is true that I have downloaded a very useful app onto my phone, which allows me to kill zombies remotely. So I do spend a lot of time killing zombies on my phone. And it is times, when I'm killing the zombies as a public service on my phone when, I could have been like oming or something. So yeah, I mean, it can be a distraction, definitely. But, if you're trying to use your phone less, you might just try not bringing it with you, although it may be that for your job or something, you have to have your phone on you all the time. But, if you don't have to have your phone on you, then you might just try like leaving it behind sometimes. So, that's a possibility. Let's see. There was a number of question marks here, so... Let's see. Is your smartphone an impediment to your being focused mindfully throughout the day, as mine is? Well, it certainly can be a distraction. And then he's got, do you have any practical tips on how I could be less distracted by my compulsion to use my smartphone throughout the day? Well, this reminds me of a book I read by Charlie Tart back when I was a monk. And he had his phone set up so that at random, it would just send messages to him saying, are you being mindful right now? And that would be a good way of using your phone, if you've got to carry your phone with you, to, sort of help you to be mindful rather than just be one-sidedly just distracting you from being mindful. So, if you can get like a little alarm to just, I assume there's some way you can do it at random. If you can't do it at random, you can have a friend just program in times that you don't know about when it's going to happen, when it's going to go off and ask you if you're being mindful or just remind you to be mindful. That can work too. But yeah, just living in this world in general is a distraction from Dhamma practice. And cell phones certainly are an aspect of that, but not the only aspect. Just standing around talking with a buddy, it can be the same thing. So... Let's see. Any more questions here? Are mindfulness and frequent smartphone use incompatible, or is it possible to blend these seemingly polar opposites? Well, it's a higher difficulty setting. The more distractions you've got, the harder it is to be mindful. So reduce distractions if you really want to be mindful throughout the day, or just really try hard to be mindful. Then you're trying at a harder difficulty setting, which will, if you succeed, then it'll make your mindfulness even better than if you're just practicing being mindful when you're in a quiet room all the time. Although, I'm not trying to badmouth being mindful in a quiet room. That's, in a way, it's it's like the bunny slope or something, or and also because there's so few distractions, you can get into deeper layers. I mean, it might be that in a quiet room, you can get into a deeper level of mindfulness, just picking up on really subtle things than, say, if you're being mindful while riding a roller coaster at a carnival. So there is that too. But yeah, I mean, aside from using your phone as an aid to help you be mindful, to like random little alarms, it's just reminding you to be mindful, and just don't carry it with you everywhere you go. I mean, if you have to carry it with you for your job or something, then that's fine. But otherwise, it's not necessary. If somebody calls you, you don't have to just pick it up immediately. At least I don't. Somebody texts me or something, it might be hours before I answer them, which might be considered rude or something, but hey, that's just the way it is. So I hope I answered that question. I think I've been answering questions a little more succinctly after my baptism by fire in the live stream last week, where I answered probably like 70 questions. And so I had to answer them relatively briefly. Anyways, I'm just going to move on to this one. This is from Rui. And Rui says, hello, Panyo. How aware of the Pali tradition was Nagarjuna, if at all? Well, Nagarjuna was not necessarily a Mahayana Buddhist. It depends on what text that he wrote that you're going to acknowledge as authentic. But for example, with regard to his main magnum opus, his most important philosophical text, the Mula Majjhima Karaka, he mentions no Mahayana Buddhism at all. And all of the texts that he quotes are texts that are also found in the Pali Canon, but they're in a kind of Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit, I guess. That it's from a different school. It's one of the pre-Mahayana schools, but it's a different school from Theravada. So the texts aren't in Pali, but they're just translations from the same original text as the Pali Canon. So he was very aware of the texts that are found in the Pali Canon, especially like the core texts, like some of the main texts that he cites in the Mula Majjhima Karaka are from the Samyukta Agama, which in Pali would be the Samyutta Nikaya. And I mean, it's right there in the text. You can look at the Pali equivalent of the texts that he is citing. So how aware was he of the Pali tradition? I assume he was aware of Theravada Buddhism. I think he was like a professor at Nalanda University, so he probably was speaking with Theravada Buddhists a lot. He may have been fluent in Pali, wouldn't surprise me, but he just was not ordained in Theravada tradition. His texts were not in Pali, they were like in Buddhist Sanskrit. But it was mostly the same text that he was reading, at least with regard to the suttas, and probably the Vinaya rules, assuming that he read Vinaya rules. So, yeah, I mean, how aware he was specifically of the Pali tradition is hard to say, because I'm not aware of him mentioning Theravada specifically or the Pali Canon specifically. But I mean, he was just going with this slightly modified, slightly different version of the suttas that are also found in the Pali Canon. And I assume, having been a teacher at Nalanda, he was fully aware of the existence of Theravada, probably was acquainted with the differences, philosophical differences between his school and the Theravada school and so forth. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Pyramid. And Pyramid says, do you have any views on Buddhist Christianity? I have seen some here on YouTube try to promote this fusion, and some of it makes sense. I'm a Catholic Christian and always interested in Theravada Buddhism. I can't leave Lord Jesus as my savior, but would also love to follow Buddha Dev in my daily life. Well, I mean, there are a few things I could say about Buddhist Christianity. For one thing, it is a saying that Pure Land Buddhists might vehemently deny, that Pure Land Buddhism is Christianity for Buddhists. I mean, there's a lot of similarities there, but if you can't leave Lord Jesus, then I don't think you're going to be substituting Lord Jesus for Amitabha Buddha. So I guess that's out. Also, it's a common belief that the Buddha himself, Gautama Buddha, the historical Buddha, is a Catholic saint, Saint Josaphat. But that also is not entirely correct, because Saint Josaphat was based on a story in the Jataka tales of one of the Buddha's previous incarnations. And so what happened was this Jataka story of, I don't remember the Pali name of the Jataka story, but it was a common like a literary genre in northern Italy, northern India. And it just became like, some of the stories just became, this common knowledge. So like Aesop's fables were common knowledge in the West around the same time. And so when, I think it was like Muslims invaded northwestern India, even they liked some of the stories. And so it got translated into Arabic. Some of the Jataka stories were translated into Arabic, where Bodhisattva got translated into Arabic as Bodhisaf. And then it started moving westwards across caravan routes and so forth. And by the time it got to Georgia or Armenia or something, it got translated as a Lodisaf. And then when it got as far as Greece, it was translated as Yoasaf. And then when it got translated into Latin, it became Josaphatus, which is in English Josaphat. And the story became well known even in Europe, and it was just the assumption of the church that a man this wise and this virtuous would have to be a good Christian, and so he got canonized. But to say that it was the Buddha himself is not entirely correct. I mean, if I was like Henry Ford in a previous existence, which I probably wasn't, but if I was Henry Ford in a previous existence, it's different from saying that I am Henry Ford. It's like people wouldn't, like history books wouldn't be declaring me to be Henry Ford. It's just a different deal. So, nevertheless, I was told by a Catholic priest that he had been to a Catholic monastery in Germany that had a shrine to all the saints. Each saint had his own shrine, and Saint Josaphat just had a statue of the Buddha sitting in meditation. But maybe Pyramid is a Catholic. So at least you've got Saint Josaphat. Sometimes I used to call myself Fray Paño Basso de las Tres Ratanas. And I was a member of the Order of Saint Josaphat, discalced. So, I mean, there is that. And of course, there's always a lot of overlap in religions. I mean, Saint John of the Cross, he would have made an excellent Buddhist. There's a lot of overlap between like Buddhist Dharma and advanced Christianity. Like when you're getting into mysticism, like Saint John of the Cross or Meister Eckhart, then there's a lot of overlap. At the lower levels, it can be very different. They're using completely different like beginning assumptions, different vocabulary and so forth. But the higher up you go, the more things converge. Some religions just never get to the top of the mountain, but the higher up you go, the more things converge. So, I mean, you can be a Catholic and be interested in Buddhism. I mean, the Catholic priest that was telling me about, what was he telling me about? Well, the Catholic priest that was telling me about something, I mean, he was ordained as a Buddhist novice when I first met him. He was a Catholic priest, and he was ordained. I mean, he's wearing monk's robes and so forth. So, I mean, there's bound to be certain contradictions. They're not entirely compatible. According to Christianity, you've got God Almighty. According to Buddhism, no God Almighty. According to Christianity, you've got an immortal soul. According to Buddhism, no immortal soul. And so there's going to be differences, but I mean, tell the truth, don't steal, that kind of stuff. That's basic. And then when you start getting up into like the really refined mysticism stuff, like St. John of the Cross, again, it's converging. So you're just gonna have to work out for yourself to what degree, what aspects of Buddhism you can fit in with your Christianity, what aspects of Christianity you can fit in with your Buddhism. Because, sometimes you're just going to have to make a call. It's like, is there a God or is there not a God? That might be kind of an important decision to make if you're a religious person. So, let's see. Get back to the question here. Do you have any views on Buddhist Christianity? Yeah, you can't just completely mix them together like milk and water because, as I say, they're contradictory to each other in certain respects. But to the extent that they can be mixed together, you can be eclectic. So like Zen Buddhism was kind of an eclectic mix of Taoism and like Mahayana Buddhism in China. Western Buddhism now is largely, with the boomer generation especially that were instrumental in importing Theravada Buddhism especially, they're sort of combining Theravada with scientific realism. There's always going to be a certain amount of eclecticism or just combining views. Whenever you take one system and put it into a different culture, it's just going to start absorbing aspects of that culture. So it does happen all the time. So, you're just going to have to work it out exactly how much you can incorporate. The stuff that they're in agreement on, that's a no-brainer. You can just do that fairly easily. It's just the parts where they don't agree, you're going to have to make a call on, which one you trust more. So, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Satori Enjoyer. And Satori Enjoyer says, last week you said the Buddhists lost ground to Hindus and Muslims in India, in part because, unlike the Hindus, they didn't fight the Mughal invaders back. What are your thoughts on Buddhists and non-violence? Should Buddhists be as radical in their embrace of ahimsa as those guys in India, or be like the Burmese now or Japanese Zen samurai of the past and embrace the warlike side of Buddhism? Well, there's really not much warlike side to Buddhism other than what has been added over the centuries from outside of Buddhism. There's, some warlike imagery. It's better to die in battle than to live in defeat. That kind of thing that you can find in the text. The Buddha himself was traditionally a member of the warrior caste in India, but Buddhism, like Orthodox Buddhism, is just uncompromising in its nonviolence. It's just uncompromisingly, radically pacifistic. So, what you're going to have to do is, if you really want to be a saint, your best bet is to become a monk. And then you're not even going to slap mosquitoes. You're not going to harm any living being if you can help it. For a layperson, it's just a personal choice. To some degree, like if you have a family to protect, you may have duties that require you to do things that are not dharmic sometimes. So I do think that any civilization, if you got an entire civilization that converts to Buddhism, then if they are uncompromising pacifists, that civilization is not going to last very long. You're going to have people willing to commit acts of violence, at least with regard to maintaining law and order and protecting the boundaries or the borders of the country. You're going to have a police force and a military to some degree, unless you're just a tiny rinky-dink little country that, like Luxembourg or something, that doesn't need an army just because nobody wants to invade Luxembourg. So I think just being realistic and pragmatic, any civilization is going to have a certain amount of martial virtue if it's going to prosper, especially if it's a large country. not just some satellite state of some other country that's going to protect them. So the question here, let's see, should Buddhists be as radical in their embrace of ahimsa as those guys in India, or be like the Burmese now or Japanese Zen samurai of the past and embrace the warlike side of Buddhism? That's going to be a personal choice for each Buddhist. And I mean, really, we don't have to worry about that nowadays, since most people in whatever country we happen to be are not Buddhists, unless you're watching this from Thailand or Burma or some such. So, yeah, I mean, be as saintly as you can. But this whole question just reminds me, please forgive me, but it reminds me of The Walking Dead, where you've got this one character, Morgan, who then spun off onto Fear the Walking Dead, who he considers all life to be sacred. He had some guy who practiced like, what's the harmless, gosh, I'm having mental blocks. The martial art where you don't hurt anybody. It's not judo. It's yeah. Well, some of you will know what I'm talking about. And anyways, his teacher was this guy who, I mean, Morgan was in a really bad place. I mean, he was like sort of verging on like psychopathy. You know, he was just killing lots of people and just seeing all kinds of atrocities. And, you know, anybody in this post-apocalyptic world of The Walking Dead, you know, almost everybody's got PTSD to some degree. So anyways, he gets a new lease on life from this guy teaching him all life is sacred. And so from then on, Morgan refuses to kill a human being. He'll still kill the zombies, but he will not kill a human being. And so there's these cases where the bad guys are trying to kill him and his friends. He has the opportunity to kill them. He won't do it. He lets them go. And then they come back and kill more of his friends. So in a case like that, I mean, if you want to be a saint, you're better off just being solitary, because then you're not getting other people killed by your refusal to defend to hurt anybody, to hurt even the bad guys. So, yeah, I mean, I've always thought that Morgan would have been a hell of a lot better off just adhering to his resolution to just be a loner, so that he won't be getting other people killed when he's refusing to kill the bad guys that are trying to kill his friends. So, I mean, that applies in real life. I mean, you don't need to have a zombie apocalypse for that to have some validity to it. But if you really want to be a saint, I mean, if you think that's really important, then certainly that is your prerogative. I mean, that's, if you consider it to be your sacred duty to follow Buddhism as strictly as you can for the sake of liberation, then that's what you should do. And if that means that you'd rather be killed than kill, then so be it. But if you're that kind of a person, you'd be better off not having a wife and kids to protect. And I mean, even just being a functioning member of society, to some degree, it's going to be detrimental to that. So I do think that, you know, like samurai Zen of Japan, I mean, it's better than like samurai without Zen. You know, Bushido with some Zen in it is superior to Bushido without Zen in it. So it's like, it kind of reduces the unskillful mental states of a soldier to at least have a little bit of Dharma inoculated into his mind, so that, you know, if he's going to kill, he's not going to kill out of rage or hatred. He's not going to enjoy killing. He's going to do it mindfully and calmly as his duty. You know, sort of like in the Bhagavad Gita. I mean, you have to do your duty. And I mean, being a saint is preferable to that, but being like an honorable samurai type soldier who acts out of duty with just calmly and mindfully, I mean, that's better than just having like the howling berserkers that are just enjoy killing. So it's just sort of a personal choice. But if you ever wind up with a large Buddhist civilization, then there's going to have to be people who are willing to fight. In Burma, a lot of the soldiers, a lot of the best, most reliable soldiers are recruited from the non-Burmese ethnic groups that live on the boundaries that are largely Christian. Strange that Christianity has adopted violence much more readily than Buddhism has. I mean, back in the day, back in medieval times, you had warrior bishops like wielding like a mace. So they wouldn't stab people, they wouldn't cut off heads, but they'd just break heads. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm going to move on to Satori Enjoyer's next question here. He says, just read something by a practicing Buddhist claiming Buddhism is closer to Charvaka or nihilist philosophy than to Vedic religion. Would you agree? Well, it depends on what you mean by Vedic religion. If you're referring to like the Rig Veda, it's like the religion of the invading Indo-Aryans, 1500 BCE, then yeah, Buddhism might more closely resemble the Charvaka philosophy than essentially a kind of polytheism with fire sacrifices, a hereditary priest class, and they're making offerings to the gods for the sake of sons, cattle, and victory in battle, that kind of thing. And I suppose I should explain what Charvaka is. The Charvaka philosophers of India were sort of like the Epicurean philosophers of the classical West. They had a bad reputation for being like atheistic and just materialists. And that's kind of what the Charvakas were. They considered pleasure to be the highest good. And, when you're dead, you're dead. There is no karma. There is no afterlife. It's all just materialism, essentially. And Buddhism really, it's not a spiritually bankrupt system like Charvaka, but like I was saying in an answer to a question above, to a worldly minded normie who takes materialism as truth, he might not have the insight to be able to tell the difference. He's seeing Buddhism at a crude, the kind of the lower levels of it. And then he's seeing this Charvaka materialism or nihilism, at crude lower levels. And, at crude lower levels, there might be a lot of overlap. But when you get up into the higher philosophy, the Charvakas really don't even have a higher philosophy. And then the Buddhists, it just goes up and up and up. So I would say that in some respects, Buddhism comes closer to Charvaka than to the Vedic religion, even if you get into like the Upanishadic stuff. When you get it to the Upanishads, like Vedanta, Buddhism and Vedanta are very similar, partly because they were debating each other and like borrowing ideas from each other. They're interacting with each other, and there was a certain kind of convergent evolution between Buddhism and Vedanta, especially. But certain similarities between Buddhism and the Charvaka, first of all, no God, so it's more or less of an atheistic system. Also, their origins may be more similar, just going with evolution, that, the Shramana tradition of India, you have the Shramanas and the Brahmanas, the philosophers and priests, philosophers and holy men. Buddhism had more of a similar origin to Charvaka, which probably arose as like an offshoot of the Indus Valley civilization religion in prehistoric times. So there's certain resemblances, but especially when you get up into Vedanta, then Buddhism and Vedanta much more closely resemble each other with regard to just outlook and morality and so forth than Buddhism and Charvaka. Like Buddhism has very finely tuned ethics. Charvaka really did not. Like I have read that the Kama Sutra of Vatsyayana is a Charvaka text. Like the first introductory chapter of the Kama Sutra is essentially explaining Charvaka philosophy with regard to enjoying sensual pleasures, how they considered that to be, the best you can go for in life. They didn't believe in an afterlife or liberation from samsara or anything. So it's, just pretty much like Epicureanism in the classical West. So let's see here. Did I answer the question? That is the question I must ask myself after talking about somebody else's question. So, yeah, I would not agree. That's the question is, would you agree that Buddhism is closer to Charvaka philosophy than Vedic religion? No, I would not agree. Although in certain respects, it's closer to Charvaka, like the atheism stuff. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Bodhisattva 969. And Bodhisattva 969 says, I will soon be going to Mutodaya Monastery. The senior monk Ajahn Chah, that's kind of a weird name, Chatamalo. I don't think I've ever seen that before. Chata, maybe he's spelling it wrong. So I'm just going to have to start the question over again because I interrupt myself very rudely. And he says, I will soon be going to Mutodaya Monastery. The senior monk Ajahn Chatamalo was the vice abbot of Ajahn Brahm in Australia for many years. Would it be inappropriate to ask him what he thinks of Ajahn Brahm's exclusion from the Thai forest monastery tradition because it was justified? Well, if you're there, and I mean, you'll get a feel for what Ajahn Chatamalo is like. You get a feel for the situation, and you'll just be able to feel into whether it's appropriate to ask him certain things. It's like there's like a dynamic, spontaneous interaction going on. You'll feel whether it's appropriate to ask. Just overall, in general, I don't think it would necessarily be inappropriate to ask him unless you ask him like a leading question. Like, that was really fucked up, huh? That kind of thing. But I don't think Bodhisattva 969 would ask the question in like a really pointed, leading way. Just, how do you feel about Ajahn Brahm getting kicked out of the Thai forest tradition? Or the Ajahn Chah tradition, I should say. And, he might even say, well, he wasn't exactly kicked out, or who knows? I mean, I don't know what his feelings would be, what his opinion would be. But I don't think that it would necessarily be inappropriate, so long as you ask in good faith and, you're just asking an open question. I don't think there'd be anything wrong with that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Twin Wasabi. Excuse me. And Twin Wasabi says, any thoughts on the push for female pastors, priests, or monks, both in the East and West? Well, a female monk would be a nun. With regard to an actual female monk, that would be an impossibility from the point of view of Theravada Buddhism. Even if some trans male was ordained as a monk while being biologically a woman, still, I mean, the ordination would just be null and void. It would be invalid, and still the person would not be a monk. So, thoughts on the push for female pastors, priests, and monks? Well, there's definitely more of a push for it in westernized countries. In Burma, I mean, as of last time I was there, which was like 2018, there was no push. There were a few nuns who were relatively famous and well-liked. They weren't fully ordained bhikkhunis or claiming to be fully ordained bhikkhunis. They were just the standard Burmese Thila Shin, which is usually an 8-precept nun or maybe a 10-precept nun. And they wear like pink and sort of a salmon color, maybe a little bit of orange. With regard to the push for female priests in the West and maybe bhikkhunis in a relatively westernized country like Thailand, that's largely just coming from Western feminism and just the insistence that men and women should be equal, if not identical. And I don't think it's necessarily helping anything, especially when you are literally deviating from the teachings of a religion for the sake of making it more modern or postmodern or politically correct or whatever. They're just like Christianity. I think I mentioned this in the previous Q&A. The New Testament calls homosexuality abomination. The Old Testament says homosexuals should simply be taken out and killed. And now you've got Christian churches who supposedly accept the Bible as the word of God, or at least inspired by God, flying rainbow flags. Methodist church, there's like half the Methodist church is like the radical leftist variety, flying rainbow flags and so forth. It's like, we celebrate abomination. It's like we go against the Bible here. And Christians in general, Western Christianity has done that a lot. Like the whole divorce thing in Christianity. The Bible says once you get married, you can't get divorced and remarried to somebody else. That is adultery. Even like ministers are getting divorced and remarried. And the Catholics get around it by just annulling the marriage instead of having a divorce. So I'm definitely digressing here, because the question wasn't about divorce or homosexuality. The question is about the push for female pastors, priests, or monks, which are nuns, both in the East and West. And it is true that with regard to leftism in the West, that the main influence they have had, like leftist politics, the main influence they have had on Theravada Buddhism, especially the main controversy that has arisen in Theravada Buddhism as a result of leftist politics in the West, is the whole idea of bhikkhunis. That the bhikkhuni order died out and went extinct hundreds of years ago in Theravada Buddhism. And now you've got people trying to revive the bhikkhuni order, and they don't have the authority to do it. And it's not really valid, but they don't care because they want gender equality. And the very fact that these nuns are being called bhikkhunis, they want to become bhikkhunis, it's mainly for the sake of official status. It's more of a political choice than a spiritual choice. It's for worldly status, which really you should be renouncing. You shouldn't become a monk or nun because of a desire for worldly status. Some like Burmese monks do that. They want upward social mobility or something by becoming a monk. But it's really not dharmic, in my opinion. So let's see. He says, any thoughts? And I guess that's what I have been sharing, is thoughts, verbalized ones. But yeah, it's like leftist politics, because most Western Buddhists are leftists. It's just flooding into Theravada, and to some degree that's seeping as far as Southeast Asian Buddhist countries and Sri Lanka also. Southeast Asian Buddhist countries. Although Burma is pretty hard-headedly traditionalist, and last I heard, I don't know if it's still true, but last I heard, any woman, any nun declaring herself to be a fully ordained bhikkhuni is going to be locked up. She's going to be thrown in jail in Burma. So, let's see. I guess I answered that question. I shared many thoughts there. They might have been semi-coherent thoughts, but they were thoughts. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Mary J. And Mary J says, what early Buddhist school had real monks? And real has a capital R. What early Buddhist school had real monks? And then in parentheses, he says, I assume after schisms, most of the monks was automatically excommunicated according to monastic rules. Well, actually, it doesn't work that way. The only way to automatically excommunicate a monk is if he commits one of the 4 parajikas or he gets castrated. Because if you don't have balls, you can't be a monk. So what happened in ancient times is you had schisms happening. The Sangha would split into 2 different Sanghas. And they didn't really commit any parajika offenses. They didn't have sex. They didn't murder anybody. They didn't steal anything necessarily. They weren't falsely declaring to have attained superhuman mental states. So, they had their balls still. And so they weren't excommunicated. if a monk is insisting upon a heretical point of view, then you can do a formal act of suspension against that monk, which means he's going to be ostracized. He's not allowed to participate in any ceremonies. You're not allowed to talk to him. He's not supposed to like sleep under the same roof with any monk in good standing. But that's as far as it goes. Nobody has the power to excommunicate a monk other than that monk himself. So the Burmese government has gotten around that to some degree by like having a monk raped by a prostitute kind of a thing, because having sex and enjoying it even just a little bit, just for one split second, then you're out. And it's very difficult for a guy to have sex without at least enjoying it a little bit. So all of the monks were real monks. They were just nana samwasaka, which means living under different communions. So all of the early Buddhist schools had real monks. And I mean, the way you can have fake monks is, I mean, if you've got monks that commit one of the parajika rules, then they're not really a monk anymore. But if they continue, wearing the robes, they don't tell anybody that they did it. They still are passing themselves off as monks, even though technically they aren't anymore. Then, I mean, that way you have a fake monk. Or if those monks that are fake monks, are performing ordinations, you have to have at least 5 monks that are real monks to perform an ordination. If 1 or 2 of those is a fake monk, then the monk who's being ordained isn't a real monk either. And so, like the Dhamma sect in Thailand, they're saying that things like that happened so rampantly that they're the only real monks left. They have an unbroken lineage, at least in Thailand. So there is that, but that's getting into Sila Bhatta Paramasa. I mean, if you're going to be worrying about, 5 centuries ago was the lineage broken so that I'm not really a monk because, 500 years ago, ordination ceremonies were conducted by monks that weren't qualified, or they did the ordination ceremony wrong or something, which caused invalid ordinations. And then, the descendants of that lineage have ordained me, then I'm not a monk either. I mean, if you start worrying about that much, then that's too much. I mean, the burden of proof should be on the accuser, saying that lineage is not a real lineage anymore. So I guess I answered that question. What early Buddhist school had real monks? All of them. All of them had real monks. I mean, they were validly ordained bhikkhus. Because the only way, I keep hitting things in my hand, the only way to cause a monk to be excommunicated, again, is if the monk excommunicates himself by breaking one of the parajika rules or losing his testicles. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rakasa. And Rakasa says, I would have loved to read the Lion's Roar interview. I guess they didn't even send you a copy. And that is true. I was interviewed by Lion's Roar magazine back when I was a monk, back around 2019, I guess. And it was one of the editors of Lion's Roar, who I assume was also a contributing writer. And he told me he was doing an article on right-wing Buddhism for Lion's Roar magazine. He asked if he could interview me. And I said, fine. And then I asked, I said, I'd like to have a copy of the interview. And he said it was against the policy of Lion's Roar. It was against the policy to let me have a copy, or for me to have like the power of veto over what he was going to include, because I know enough about like leftist publishers and leftist writers that they will try to skew things a bit. They might take things out of context or something. So I at least wanted the right to look at it before it was published and say, well, this is not accurate. He said, no, that's against our policy. You can't do that. So then we had a long interview. It had to have lasted more than an hour, where he's asking sort of these gotcha questions. And one thing I was going to say in my recent video with Brian Rue, and then I got distracted because I get distracted easy, or, just sort of go off on a different tangent or something, was sometimes he'd be trying to ask me gotcha questions. sort of like someone interviewing Donald Trump or something. They're trying to get in these gotcha questions, like my salute to Brian, hail Brian. And he's asking about why I'm doing Nazi salutes. And I said, no, it's not Nazi salute. That's Romulan. It's on Star Trek. The Nazis didn't thump their chest first. Even Captain Kirk did that. And then another one of these gotcha questions was, how can I justify using offensive speech, like using harsh speech that offends people and so forth. And I said what I said to Brian in the interview. It's like, it's the duty of any serious Buddhist, even if they hear offensive speech, not to be offended by it. They should forgive the speaker. And then it was just like crickets. I mean, he just went silent after I said that part, because of course that just goes against the whole leftist narrative. Another time he went silent was trying to, a lot of like neo-Marxists will deny that neo-Marxism is even a thing. It's like, he was sort of trying to call me out on using terms like cultural Marxists and so forth. And at one point I asked him, you must have heard of the Frankfurt School. And again, he just went totally silent. It was just this deafening silence. So anyways, they didn't send me a copy, and they wound up not publishing the article. Partly, I assume, because things just weren't going their way. I assume they wanted to show right-wing Buddhism, like conservative Buddhism, as something malignant. And really, I mean, the right-wing Buddhists, the conservative Buddhists, are the ones who come closer to genuine original Dhamma. I mean, the tradition, most Buddhists, most Theravada Buddhists in the West are traditionalist conservative Buddhists, because most of them are Asian, coming from a traditional Buddhist culture. But among the Westerners, most of the Buddhists are left-wing neo-Marxists, essentially, ultra-liberals. And I've discussed why that is. It's like in the West, if you're going to be a traditionalist conservative and you've got some religious leanings, then in all likelihood you're going to be Christian. It's the people who reject the traditions and just the standards of Western society that they become leftists, and they go for some other religion other than Christianity, as a general rule. In my case, I didn't become a Buddhist because I was a leftist. I became a Buddhist because I was studying various different spiritual systems, and Buddhism really was the most compatible with me. So yeah, unfortunately, I didn't get a copy of that interview. Otherwise, I would have published it long ago. And so the next question is from Stellar Supreme. And Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, says, do you consider Protestant Buddhists who do layperson practices to really be aspiring to completed insight and spiritual power, considering there's a kind of backsliding to after-death karma? The Protestant Buddhists who do layperson practices, really, I do think that a lot of them are aspiring to full enlightenment, and they think, well, I mean, it can just happen to anybody. It can just happen accidentally. So, certainly the door is not closed for these people. And a lot of them, they just are almost resentful of the existence of monks. Some of them are positively resentful of the existence of monks because it makes their own lukewarmness seem not good enough somehow. And so, I mean, they think that they're just as good as monks and nuns. So I assume those that even believe in enlightenment will say, yeah, I'm striving for enlightenment, even if they really aren't, or they're just kind of striving a little bit in their spare time or something. So let's see. Do I consider Protestant Buddhists who do layperson practices to really be aspiring to completed insight and spiritual power? Yeah, I mean, you don't underestimate the arrogance of the Western mind. Americans, I mean, I can speak from experience on Americans because I'm an American and I've lived in America. They want the best of everything. Enlightenment is the best. They want that. They also want the best car and the best cell phone. They just want the best that they can get, and they don't want to settle for less. It's almost like, it's to some degree, it's like a consumerist mentality. And so, yeah, they're not going to deny that they want enlightenment, but they just want enlightenment and everything else too. They just want it all. And, that's not all Americans. There are a lot of humble, especially Goenka practitioners. A lot of them are very humble. They're saying, well, it's not going to happen in this lifetime, which in my opinion is going too far, because it can happen to anybody. Enlightenment can happen. It may take some sort of catastrophe to just slam you out of your samsaric rut, but still it can happen. And you shouldn't just close the door and lock it and say, no, I can't become enlightened in this life, because it's better to have the door open even if you don't go through it. So I guess I answered that question. Maybe not in precisely the way Stellar Supreme was expecting, but I'm pretty sure I answered it. So I'm going to be moving on to Stellar Supreme, also known as Lieberlam's next question, which is, should we be basing a belief in karma on a belief in supreme psychic powers extending from samadhi, like in the stock phrase says, quote, when their mind has become immersed in samadhi like this, purified, bright, flawless, rid of corruptions, pliable, workable, steady, and imperturbable, they project it and extend it towards recollection of past lives, unquote. So they project it and extend it towards the knowledge of the death and rebirth of sentient beings, unquote, such that we don't take it as hearsay or something. Well, this whole question is kind of a strange one to me. It's like, should we be basing a belief in karma on a belief in supreme psychic powers? No, because you're basing your belief on something you've never experienced. You're basing your belief on hearsay, because so long as you haven't had these psychic powers, then you're just saying, well, according to the people with psychic powers, then yeah. To some degree, you could say that, people that have psychic powers that could look back on their past lives and can see beings going in accordance with their karma and so forth, that would be some evidence anyway. But I certainly wouldn't base my belief on karma entirely on psychic powers that I do not have. Just, it's all hypothetical. It's essentially guessing. So if you're going to base your belief in karma on something, I'd base it on something that you have some personal experience of. Like, for example, like a really obvious elementary level of karma is just the automatic pilot that drives us through life when we're not fully conscious, which is pretty much all the time. So the automatic pilot, just habitual responses to things, so that you can be thinking about what you want for dinner while driving your car and so forth. You're not just carefully observing everything going on in traffic and so forth. It's just base brain, just automatic pilot stuff while you're thinking of something else. And that really is like a very fundamental, elementary example of karma. It goes way deeper than that. It goes into a metaphysical level where it's the same kind of automatic pilot, habitual responses that are causing you to create the samsara, this version of reality that you happen to be in. But at least you're projecting, you're expanding out from something that you have personal experience of, instead of basing it on something that you read in a book that you don't have personal experience of. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supremes, formerly known as Lieberlam's third question, which is, do you consider it likely that Buddhism would have prevailed over competing philosophies if the Buddha had not spoken from a place of supermundane power and wisdom as a real historical figure? It's hard to say. It's sort of a logical fallacy to say that if the situation was different, things would have turned out in this other way, because you can't really know that based on personal experience either, because you only know what happened and you don't know all the factors that caused things to happen the way they did. There are religions like, Hinduism, for example. Hinduism prevailed over competing philosophies. But I mean, it wasn't by one enlightened founder. I mean, probably most of the founders of Hinduism were not enlightened beings. Some of them, I assume, were. Let's see. As a real historical figure. Yeah. I don't think necessarily that is the case. I think that the fact that Buddhism was taught by an extremely wise, presumably enlightened being, certainly strengthened it over other systems that were just started by some philosopher who hammered out certain points of view, or is just like Judaism, where it's just kind of a social thing that's kind of evolved over the centuries. It's hard to say that Judaism or Hinduism, for that matter, really had a founder. I mean, you could say kind of Moses was the founder of Judaism, although the historicity of Moses himself is in question. I mean, did Moses really exist? Or, I mean, even if there was somebody upon whom the story of Moses was based, that the truth probably deviates from the actual biography of this historical personage. There's a lot of people arguing the same kind of stuff about Christianity. So let's see here. Let's try and answer the question again. Do you consider it likely that Buddhism would have prevailed over competing philosophies if the Buddha had not spoken from a place of supermundane power and wisdom as a real historical figure? It's really hard to say. Although, I mean, you could say that Buddhism wouldn't have arisen at all because it was the teachings of this historical figure called Gautama Buddha, at least originally. I think most of what passes for Buddhism now was not taught by the historical Buddha, and a lot of it he would probably have denounced. So, and even by the time Buddhism became like a major spiritual system, like in society, it struck traction, had set down roots and everything, already it may have been less than 50% genuine teachings of the Buddha. And some of the stuff that gets added is the stuff that makes it more popular. And that's just unavoidable. So it's a lot of the times in a religious system, it's like the silly made up stuff is the stuff that makes the tradition popular to the normies. And the normies constitute the majority of any population, really. You know, it's just the simple villagers who don't understand advanced metaphysics or mysticism, anything like that. They just want stories and ceremonies and stuff that they can see and touch and feel, and that makes them feel a little bit better in life. And I mean, then a lot of that stuff is like devotionalism and just kind of pointless ceremonies. So it's really hard to answer that question. I mean, there's no way you could answer it with certainty. You know, how would it, if there was something like Buddhism that arose spontaneously as a coalescing of different philosophical ideas, that, you know, the founder was maybe a mythological figure or something, then, I mean, some Hinduism is like that. Yeah, it's hard to say exactly whether it would have been more popular or less popular or what would have happened. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Zenithoid. And Zenithoid says, after I look to see what, okay, got to see the time, see the timer, see how long I've been talking. And Zenithoid says, I've recently been introducing my brother who is a scientific materialist to Buddhism. He says that while Buddhism is the religion with the most wisdom to offer, he criticizes Buddhists for supposedly clinging to nirvana when they should really accept their pointless death and annihilation. How would you respond to this critique? Well, I mean, I don't know of very many Buddhists who are clinging to nirvana. I mean, literally, you can't cling to nirvana, but I mean, I met very few Buddhists who are even clinging to the concept of nirvana. That nirvana is just sort of like this, you know, this nebulous something off in the distance for most devout Buddhists, I think. And, it's just something, this sooner or later I'll get there, but I'm not really going for it in this life. So, one thing you can point out to a scientific materialist, first of all, you can bring up Immanuel Kant and his thing in itself and the thing as it seems. Kant was no idiot. And he pointed out very, very clearly that no amount of working out the thing as it seems, which would include science, no amount of scientism, no amount of scientific endeavor, scientific method is going to get you one iota closer to knowing the thing in itself, to knowing ultimate reality. And even most scientists, most scientific realists will agree that this world that we see is not reality. That color, for example, it doesn't exist outside of a mind. That it's just a kind of symbolic interpretation of certain wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation. And what appears to be solid matter is more than 99.99% empty space. And what matter actually is there is just these little sparkling specks of energy. So, no scientific materialist can know ultimate reality because they're clueless. It's really not even on their radar. They're dealing with concepts and mathematics and so forth. And that's all just stuff that's conjured up in this gray blob of meat, according to them especially. How is this little gray blob of meat going to understand reality? That's not what it's designed for. So a scientific materialist is really just basing his nihilism or atheism or whatever on ignorance, literally. They accuse Christians or theists of believing in God because of ignorance, but their denial of God is entirely based on ignorance. It's like, we don't see any God, therefore there isn't one. We can't see God, therefore there isn't one. Of course, that wouldn't really apply to Buddhism very well because Buddhism doesn't insist that there's a God, but it does insist that there is an ultimate reality which is beyond perception. And that, it just stands to reason that there is an ultimate reality beyond these symbols conjured up in the gray blob of meat. And so they just pretend that just doesn't exist, it can't exist, and when you're dead, et cetera, et cetera. So, that might be a good starting point. Let's see. So he says, he criticizes Buddhists for supposedly clinging to nirvana, which they really don't, most of them, when they should really accept their pointless death and annihilation. Well, he doesn't really know that either. He's guessing too. But have I answered this question well enough that I can move on to the next one? Yeah, pointless death and annihilation. In a way, Buddhism would even agree that death is kind of pointless, but the annihilation part is one of the two extremes. You've got annihilationist view, you've got eternalist view. When you're dead, that is one extreme. You've got an eternal soul that lives forever, that is another extreme. Buddhism takes the path by the middle. And most people just cannot understand that path by the middle. They just do not get it. And you can explain it to them till you're blue in the face and they still won't get it. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's next question here. Karma is will, yet enlightened beings who no longer create karma still take actions, meaning they will things to occur. This could be seen as a contradiction, but I think this indicates that arahants are the only people who truly have free will because their mind, if we can even still call it that, is no longer constricted by the causal chains of samsara. Do you consider this assessment accurate, or is there a better explanation? Well, first of all, arahants, they're not people. Arahants in reality, an arahant has realized that he doesn't exist or she doesn't exist, that people don't exist. So that's one little niggle I might I might prefer, spelled with an O, not an E. Prefer. Let's see. Let's see. I'm gonna have to read this again. See, karma is will. Yet enlightened beings who no longer create karma still take actions, meaning they will things to occur. No, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will things to occur. It can mean that there is just a semblance of willing things to occur. Like, for example, in Abhidhamma philosophy, Orthodox Theravada, they have an arahant has what's called the kriya chitta, the functional consciousness, which allows them to do things without creating karma. And I think that was caused by the Abhidhamma authors not really understanding how it works. But they do have still a semblance of will, even though they've just transcended samsara. They've transcended the whole semblance of things. The semblance is still there. They're just not identified with it anymore. It's just nature taking its course. So, and that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it that I have considered many times is that a fully enlightened being, he's not really existing anymore. He's not even believing that he's existing anymore. And consequently, it's the karma of the people around that arahant that make him seem to exist and make him seem to make decisions and have will and all that. But an arahant sitting alone in a forest, it's like the tree that nobody hears it falling down. If an arahant is alone, then you could say there's nobody there. And like Ram Dass used to say about Neem Karoli Baba, it's like the better you got to know him, the more you realized there really wasn't anybody there. It was just like your own karma being reflected back at you. And another thing you could say about free will, it's kind of strange that an arahant might have no free will at all, just because the arahant always does the right thing. It's like if you always have to do the right thing, you have no choice but to just do the right thing. So that's something to consider also, although free will is logically impossible, I think. But that doesn't mean that it can't still exist just because something is logically impossible. But I do think that the way free will might possibly exist is that we have like a self-referential mind, and anything that's self-referential can produce paradox. And so we've got a self-referential mind that can somehow manifest the paradox of free will arising when it's logically impossible. So it's like, sort of like St. John of the Cross was saying that a Christian arahant, someone who has reached the stage of perfection, they no longer have self-will. They're no longer making their own decisions. It's like they've just become puppets of God. They are motivated just by divine will, and God is just using them as an instrument, so to speak, which kind of is in accordance with my idea that it's the karma of other people that are moving the arahant's arms and legs, or seem to be moving the arms and legs. It's just a reflection of their own karma because the enlightened being really isn't generating anymore. Although going with Orthodox tradition, an enlightened being still has like the latent karma of past lives and so forth that is still kind of pushing it through samsara. And I really don't know. I'm really not sure to what extent I'm actually answering these questions. There's a certain amount of subtlety in the Q&A today. So, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I would point out that what an arahant has attained is what the Tao Te Ching calls wu wei, or non-action. So, that would be no karma. Action is a literal translation of the word karma or kamma. So it's like he who follows the learning increases day by day. He who follows Tao decreases day by day. He becomes less and less until he arrives at non-action. With non-action, there is nothing he cannot achieve. That's one of the chapters of the Tao Te Ching that I've took the trouble to memorize. So, yeah, trying to understand arahants intellectually is pretty much an exercise in futility anyhow. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is the last question. By golly, it always takes me by surprise, or it usually takes me by surprise. And this is from Power. And Power says, I've been hearing that Buddha never preached to his disciples to follow his teachings blindly. In fact, he was quite liberal and allowed his followers to pick and choose their beliefs. Is this accurate? Well, it's partly accurate. I think the first part of the question is accurate in that the Buddha never preached to his disciples to follow his teachings blindly. Yeah, he discouraged people following his teachings blindly, that you got to, I mean, you can take it as a hypothesis. You can accept what he's saying as a hypothesis, and then you got to put it to the test yourself to see if it's true or not. But the second part of the question is like, he was quite liberal and allowed his followers to pick and choose their beliefs. Well, no, that's not accurate, because if they got to pick and choose their beliefs, there wouldn't be any Buddhism. Buddhism would just be anything that people just decided to believe. And it didn't work like that. Like, you could believe or not believe what he was saying, but if you went and just asserted the exact opposite of some of the things he was saying, then even in like very ancient texts, like the Patimokkha rules, then you would be admonished and possibly punished. You know, like I was talking about how a monk could misrepresent the Buddha by saying what the Buddha said were stumbling blocks to the holy life really aren't stumbling blocks to the holy life. And mainly he was referring to indulgence and sensuality. So, I mean, if you just flatly disbelieved in karma and insisting when you're dead, that kind of thing, then yeah, you could have gotten into trouble even in very ancient times in the Sangha, because, I mean, if you just want to be agnostic, you want to be a skeptic in the classical sense and not believe anything in particular, you know, not A. You know, you just want to just be open-minded. I mean, that would work. But when you start believing things like, you know, it's like there's no karma and you could kill 1 million sentient beings and it would have no effect on your spirit, that kind of thing. No. I mean, the Buddha wouldn't go that far. So he did not allow his followers to just pick and choose their beliefs, although he did allow his followers to believe or remain agnostic with regard to a lot of what he was saying. And the ideal situation is you remain agnostic until you get the confirmation that you require to see, yeah, he was right about that. So I think somebody who just flatly denied the Four Noble Truths, for example, probably would not be considered a Buddhist. And if they were ordained, there's a good chance they'd get formal acts against them if anyone was foolish enough to ordain them in the first place. And that's it. I just answered that question too. By golly. And so, if you got any more questions you think I can answer about ancient India, Theravada Buddhism, ancient Buddhism in general, monasticism, meditation, Buddhist practice, anything like that, questions about me personally, I'm generally pretty good at answering those. Feel free to ask them in the comments below, or if you have access to the Discord server, you can ask them there. If you have access to Subscribestar, you can ask them there. And like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And be happy.